December 5th, 1945. The Second World War had ended just months earlier. The world was exhaling after 6 years of unprecedented destruction. Victory flags still hung in windows across America. Sailors were coming home. Factories that had churned out bombers were retooling for peacetime. The future seemed bright, peaceful, inevitable. But on that Wednesday afternoon, off the coast of Florida, 5 U.S. Navy Avenger torpedo bombers lifted into a clear blue sky for what should have been a routine training flight. 2 hours later, they would vanish without a trace, taking 14 men with them into oblivion. And when rescue planes went searching, one of those would disappear too, along with its 13-man crew. 27 men, 6 aircraft gone, no wreckage, no bodies, no answers. This is the story of Flight 19. The disappearance that would birth a legend, spawn 1,000 theories, and create one of the most enduring mysteries of the 20th century. This is the story of how a training exercise became a nightmare, and how that nightmare gave birth to something even stranger, the Bermuda Triangle. But before we dive into mystery and speculation, before we explore the theories that have captivated minds for nearly 8 decades, we need to understand something crucial. These were real men. They had families, they had futures, and on that December afternoon, something went terribly, inexplicably wrong. Naval Air Station, Fort Lauderdale, Florida, 2:10 p.m. Lieutenant Charles Taylor, an experienced pilot with over 2,500 flying hours and combat experience in the Pacific Theater, climbed into the cockpit of his TBM Avenger. He'd survived the war. He'd flown missions where death brushed past him like a shadow. Now, back stateside, he was leading a routine navigation training flight, designated Flight 19. The mission was simple, almost mundane. A standard overwater navigation exercise that student pilots flew regularly. The route formed a triangle over the Atlantic, fly east from Fort Lauderdale for 56 miles, to Hens and Chicken Shoals for bombing practice, then north for 67 miles, then southwest back to base. Total flight time, approximately 2 hours. Weather forecast, favorable. Visibility, excellent. With Taylor were 4 other Avengers, each crewed by student pilots. Captain Edward Powers, Second Lieutenant Forrest Gerber, Staff Sergeant George Paunessa, Private First Class William Lightfoot, Corporal Alan Cosnar, and others. 13 men in total, not counting Taylor. Young men, trained men, following a route that had been flown hundreds of times before. The TBM Avenger was no fragile aircraft. This was a war-proven torpedo bomber, a beast of a plane that had seen action across the Pacific. It could take damage and keep flying. It had emergency flotation gear. These weren't experimental craft or outdated relics. They were reliable military aircraft in their prime. At 2:10 p.m., the 5 Avengers roared down the runway and lifted into the Florida sky. The sun glinted off their wings. Radio operators logged their departure. Everything was normal, routine, forgettable. They flew east, out over the Atlantic's blue expanse. The bombing practice at Hens and Chicken Shoals went as planned. Dummy bombs fell toward their targets. The pilots banked and turned. By all accounts, the first leg of the mission was textbook perfect. But then, something changed. At approximately 3:45 p.m., more than an hour and a half into what should have been a 2-hour flight, the tower at Fort Lauderdale picked up a strange radio transmission. It was Lieutenant Taylor's voice, but something was wrong. Something in his tone set off alarms. "Calling tower," Taylor said. "This is an emergency. We seem to be off course. We cannot see land. Repeat, we cannot see land." The controller responded calmly, asking for their position. Taylor's reply would become one of the most analyzed, debated, and quoted statements in aviation history. "We're not sure of our position. We can't be sure just where we are. We seem to be lost." Lost. An experienced combat pilot with 2,500 hours flying a simple training route in clear weather was lost. But it gets stranger. What happened next wasn't a sudden catastrophic failure. It wasn't an explosion or a crash. It was something more unsettling. A slow, confused descent into disorientation that shouldn't have been possible, given the conditions and the equipment these men had. The radio transmissions from Flight 19 were picked up not just by Fort Lauderdale, but by multiple facilities and even other aircraft in the area. We have records of these conversations, fragmented, static-filled, but revealing. And what they reveal is a flight leader who became increasingly convinced that his instruments were malfunctioning, that he was somewhere he shouldn't be, that the very ocean beneath him was wrong. "Both my compasses are out," Taylor reported at one point. "I'm trying to find Fort Lauderdale. I'm overland. But it's broken. I'm sure I'm in the Keys, but I don't know how far down." Pause on that. Taylor believed he was over the Florida Keys, the chain of islands that stretches southwest from Florida's southern tip into the Gulf of Mexico. If true, he'd need to fly northeast to reach Fort Lauderdale. But here's the problem. He almost certainly wasn't over the Keys. Based on the timeline and last known positions, Flight 19 was likely somewhere over the Bahamas, east of Florida. The Keys are to the south and west of Fort Lauderdale. The Bahamas are to the east and north. These are opposite directions. If Taylor was flying based on a wrong assumption about his location, every correction he made would take him further from safety. The tower tried to help. "What is your altitude?" they asked. They tried to get Taylor to switch to the emergency frequency. They suggested he fly west toward the setting sun. West would take him to the Florida coast, no matter where he was over the Atlantic. But Taylor seemed resistant to suggestions. He'd confer with his fellow pilots. The radio filled with confused chatter from multiple voices. "Damn it, if we could just fly west, we would get home. We don't know which way west is. Everything looks wrong, strange. Even the ocean doesn't look as it should." That last phrase has echoed through decades of analysis. Even the ocean doesn't look as it should. What does that mean? The ocean is the ocean, isn't it? Water and waves and horizon. What could make experienced pilots feel that something fundamental about the world beneath them was wrong? As the afternoon wore on, the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. In that era, before GPS, before sophisticated navigation systems, pilots had a backup that never failed: follow the sun. In December, in Florida, the sun sets in the west-southwest. The coast was west. This was elementary navigation, but Taylor seemed convinced that the sun's position couldn't be trusted. Or perhaps, more troubling, he couldn't tell where the sun was setting. Some of the transmissions suggest overcast conditions developed, though the official weather reports indicated clear skies. By 4:45 p.m., a full hour after the first distress call, Flight 19 had been in the air for nearly 3 hours. Fuel would be running low. The tower tried desperately to establish a clear radio connection, to get a fix on their position using radio direction finding equipment. But the signals were weak, fading in and out. At times, other aircraft in the area could hear Flight 19 more clearly than the tower could. Powers, one of the student pilots, took over radio communication at one point. His transmissions were clearer than Taylor's. He seemed less certain about their position, but more willing to follow instructions. However, military protocol meant Taylor, as the flight leader and superior officer, remained in command. "We're not sure where we are," Powers said. "We think we must be 225 miles northeast of base." If that was accurate, they were way out over the Atlantic, far beyond where they should have been. But the tower couldn't confirm, and crucially, Flight 19 either couldn't or wouldn't switch to the emergency frequency that would have made radio direction finding easier. At 5:15 p.m., the sun was setting. The temperature was dropping. Another transmission crackled through. "When the first man gets down to 10 gallons of gas, we'll all land in the water together." Together. There's something both heroic and heartbreaking in that. Whatever was happening, these men were staying together. The military trains you that way. You don't abandon your squadron. But it also meant that if Taylor's navigation was wrong, all 5 planes would go down together, not just one. The tower kept calling. Other aircraft tried to raise them. The transmissions from Flight 19 grew weaker, more intermittent. And then, at approximately 6:20 p.m., Over 4 hours after takeoff, nearly 2.5 hours after the first distress call, the radio fell silent. Flight 19 was gone. But the disappearances weren't over yet. When Flight 19 failed to return, and their distress calls indicated they were lost at sea, Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale launched a massive search and rescue operation. Multiple aircraft scrambled into the darkening sky. Ships put out to sea. Every available resource was thrown at finding 5 downed Avengers and their 14 crew members. Among the rescue aircraft was a PBM Mariner flying boat, a twin-engine patrol bomber designed for long-range maritime reconnaissance. The Martin Mariner was a capable aircraft, though crews had nicknamed it the Flying Gas Tank because of its tendency to leak fuel vapors, which could be ignited by a spark. Still, it was perfect for search and rescue operations over water. Training 49, as this Mariner was designated, took off from Naval Air Station Banana River, now Patrick Air Force Base, at 7:27 p.m. with 13 crew members aboard. Their mission was to search the last known area where Flight 19's transmissions had originated. The crew checked in with their base at 7:30 p.m., confirming they were en route to the search area. The radio operator acknowledged it was a routine communication, and it was the last anyone ever heard from Training 49. The flying boat and its 13 men simply vanished. No distress call, no mayday, no SOS. One moment they were on the radio, professional and clear. The next moment, silence. 13 more men swallowed by the same darkness that had taken Flight 19. The SS Gaines Mills, a merchant ship in the area, reported seeing an explosion and a widespread oil slick in the vicinity where Training 49 should have been flying. This suggested the Mariner had suffered a catastrophic mid-air explosion, possibly from those accumulated fuel vapors finding an ignition source. But when ships reached the location, they found nothing. No wreckage, no debris field, no bodies. The ocean, which should have been littered with floating evidence of a plane crash, was empty. So now we have 6 aircraft missing, 27 men vanished, and the search had only just begun. Through the night and into the next days, one of the largest air-sea rescue operations in U.S. history unfolded. Over 300 aircraft from the Navy, Coast Guard, and Army Air Forces combed the Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico. Surface vessels searched thousands of square miles of ocean. British authorities in the Bahamas joined the search. The operation covered 250,000 square miles of sea and coastline. They found nothing. No wreckage from the Avengers. No oil slicks except the one unconfirmed report. No floating debris. No life rafts. No bodies. The ocean had swallowed 6 aircraft and 27 men as completely as if they'd never existed. The search continued for 5 days before being officially called off on December 10th. In the official Navy report, the conclusion regarding Flight 19 was stark and unprecedented. Cause unknown. Not mechanical failure, not weather, not pilot error, unknown. For a military that investigated every incident with forensic precision, that prides itself on learning from disasters, this was essentially an admission of bafflement. The Navy Board of Inquiry later amended the report. Initially, they'd leaned toward blaming Lieutenant Taylor, suggesting his confusion and disorientation led to the loss. But Taylor's mother fought back, demanding the record reflect that her son was an experienced, capable pilot. Eventually, the report was changed to reflect that the true cause simply couldn't be determined. 27 families mourned. 27 sets of personal effects were packed and sent home. 27 empty chairs at Christmas dinner that year. And America, still raw from the losses of World War II, tried to make sense of how experienced military pilots could simply vanish in peacetime over familiar waters in good weather. But we're not done yet. Because the disappearance of Flight 19 wasn't an isolated incident, it was the match that lit a much larger, stranger fire. For years, the loss of Flight 19 remained what it was, a tragic, puzzling accident. The Navy concluded it was most likely a combination of factors: compass failure, disorientation, bad decisions and running out of fuel far from shore. The planes sank in deep water where they'd never be found. Sad, but not supernatural. But then, in the 1950s and 60s, something changed. Writers and researchers began noticing a pattern. Flight 19 wasn't the only disappearance in this region. Ships and planes had been vanishing in the waters between Florida, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico for decades. And when you started connecting those disappearances, mapping them out, they formed a rough triangle. In 1964, writer Vincent Gaddis published an article in Argosy magazine titled "The Deadly Bermuda Triangle." The name stuck, and suddenly, Flight 19 wasn't just a military mystery, it was proof of something far stranger. Charles Berlitz's 1974 book, The Bermuda Triangle, became a massive bestseller, bringing the mystery to mainstream consciousness. The book cataloged dozens of disappearances: the USS Cyclops, a Navy cargo ship that vanished with 309 men in 1918, the Star Tiger and Star Ariel passenger planes that disappeared in 1948 and 1949, the Douglas DC-3 that vanished in 1948, sailing vessels, fishing boats, private planes, all gone without a trace in the same general area. The theories multiplied like rabbits. Some were scientific, pointing to unusual magnetic variations in the region that could confuse compasses. Others noted the unpredictable weather, the sudden storms, the rogue waves, the water spouts that could appear without warning. The Gulf Stream's strong currents could quickly carry wreckage far from a crash site or pull it down to the deep ocean floor. But those explanations weren't exciting enough for a public hungry for mystery, so the theories grew more exotic. Alien abductions, with Flight 19 serving as evidence that extraterrestrials were harvesting humans. Time portals that opened in the ocean and swallowed vessels into other dimensions. The lost city of Atlantis beneath the waves, its ancient technology still functioning and disrupting modern navigation. Underwater pyramids, magnetic vortexes, government conspiracy, and cover-ups of secret weapons tests. Lieutenant Taylor's words, "Even the ocean doesn't look as it should," were quoted endlessly as proof that he'd seen something impossible, something that couldn't be explained by conventional physics. His confusion about his position became evidence not of human error, but of instruments going haywire in the presence of unknown forces. Flight 19 had transformed from a tragedy into a pop culture phenomenon. It appeared in movies, TV shows, books, and documentaries. It became shorthand for the mysterious, the unexplained, the genuinely weird. Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind even featured the Flight 19 Avengers discovered in the Mexican desert, perfectly preserved, their crews missing, abducted by benevolent aliens. The Bermuda Triangle became one of the world's most famous cursed locations, right alongside Area 51 and Loch Ness. Insurance companies were asked if they charged higher rates for ships crossing it. They didn't. The Coast Guard confirmed that the area has no more disappearances than any other heavy traffic region of ocean. Cruise ships marketed Bermuda Triangle crossings to thrill-seeking tourists. But here's the thing about legends: they often tell us more about what we want to believe than what actually happened. And the legend of Flight 19 and the Bermuda Triangle says something profound about humanity's relationship with mystery. We want there to be places where the rules break down. We want there to be things that science can't explain, not yet, maybe not ever. In a world that had just been through the most scientifically advanced war in history, a war that ended with nuclear weapons and the terrifying proof that humans could now destroy everything, maybe there was comfort in the idea that nature still held secrets, that there were still mysteries beyond our control or understanding. Flight 19 gave us permission to wonder, to imagine that the universe was stranger than it appeared, that not every question had an answer in a neat Navy report. But what if we step back from the legend and look again at what we actually know? What if we separate the facts from the mythology? Does the mystery disappear? Or does something even more interesting emerge? Let's reconstruct what most likely happened to Flight 19 based on the evidence we have and expert analysis conducted in the decades since. This explanation isn't as thrilling as aliens or Atlantis, but it reveals something equally profound about human vulnerability and the thin line between routine and disaster. Lieutenant Charles Taylor reported for duty that day with a hangover. He'd been out late the night before and almost didn't fly the mission. He'd asked to be excused from the flight, but was told he needed to lead it. This wasn't a fresh, sharp pilot. This was someone operating below optimal capacity from the start. More critically, Taylor was unfamiliar with the area. He'd recently been transferred from Miami to Fort Lauderdale and hadn't flown many training missions in these waters. His mental map of the region wasn't as solid as it should have been for a flight instructor. When Flight 19 completed its bombing run and turned north for the second leg, something went wrong with Taylor's compass. Possibly both of his compasses, the magnetic compass and the gyro compass. This wasn't supernatural. Compasses fail. They malfunction. In 1945, these were mechanical instruments, not digital systems with redundancies. Without functioning compasses, Taylor had to navigate by dead reckoning, estimating position based on speed, time, and direction. But if he made a wrong initial assumption about his position, every subsequent calculation would be wrong too. Here's what likely happened. After the bombing run, Flight 19 was supposed to turn north, but Taylor, disoriented by his malfunctioning compasses and unfamiliar with the specific geography, may have turned the wrong way or misjudged the turn. Instead of flying north along the Bahamas and then west to Florida, he may have flown further east and north, deeper into the Atlantic. When he finally realized something was wrong and looked down, expecting to see the Florida Keys, which he was familiar with from his previous posting in Miami, he instead saw the many small islands of the Bahamas. From the air, the Bahamas can look similar to the Keys. Small islands, shallow water, similar color patterns. If Taylor mentally locked onto the idea that he was over the Keys, that false belief would explain everything that followed. If you think you're over the Keys and need to get to Fort Lauderdale, you fly northeast. But if you're actually over the Bahamas and fly northeast, you're heading out into the open Atlantic, away from any hope of landfall. Every decision Taylor made after that initial misidentification would have been logical based on his false premise, but disastrous in reality. The tower tried to help, but they couldn't override his conviction about his position. The student pilots deferred to their commanding officer's judgment. And so Flight 19 flew northeast, burning fuel, moving further from safety with every passing mile. As sunset approached and fuel ran low, Taylor faced an impossible situation. If he was wrong about his position, if that wasn't the Keys beneath him, then he'd flown his squadron out into the Atlantic with no way back. The radio transmissions show him grappling with this possibility, the dawning horror that his certainty might be wrong. When the fuel gauges showed 10 gallons remaining, perhaps 15 minutes of flight time, the decision was made. They would ditch together in the ocean. Navy procedure for water landings was clear. Stay with the aircraft as long as it floats. Deploy life rafts. Stick together. Wait for rescue. But here's the cruel reality. TBM Avengers were heavy aircraft. When they hit the water, especially in rough seas or at high speed, they tended to sink fast. Too fast for crews to deploy life rafts. Too fast sometimes to escape the cockpit. And the Atlantic, even off the Bahamas, can be rough. The water temperature in December, while not Arctic, was cold enough to induce hypothermia within hours. If Flight 19 ditched far out in the Atlantic, and all evidence suggests they did, they likely sank in deep water, very deep water. The Puerto Rico Trench, one of the deepest points in the Atlantic Ocean, lies in this region. Planes that sink into such depths are crushed by pressure, scattered by currents, and lost forever. The ocean at those depths is effectively space, a dark, pressurized void where nothing human survives intact. As for the rescue plane Training 49, the most likely explanation remains that tragic but plausible one, an in-flight explosion caused by accumulated fuel vapors finding a spark. The PBM Mariner was known for this vulnerability. The reported explosion in oil slicks support this theory. That no wreckage was found isn't surprising. A mid-air explosion over deep water, followed by hours before search ships arrived, would leave little trace. This explanation requires no supernatural forces, no aliens, no time warps, just mechanical failure, human error, a series of bad decisions based on a false premise, and the vast, indifferent ocean swallowing the evidence. But does that explanation make the mystery less profound? I'd argue it doesn't, because the question we're left with is perhaps more unsettling than any paranormal theory. How could experienced, trained men become so disoriented, so convinced of a wrong belief that they flew themselves to their deaths? How could clear skies and modern equipment and military discipline fail so completely? The answer reveals something about human cognition that applies far beyond Flight 19. The disappearance of Flight 19 is a story about how we construct reality and how that construction can fail catastrophically. Lieutenant Taylor's compasses malfunctioned. That was the trigger. But what followed wasn't a mechanical failure. It was a cognitive one. Taylor formed a belief about his position. That belief was wrong. But once formed, it became a lens through which he interpreted every piece of new information. Islands that looked sort of like the Keys became proof he was over the Keys. The sun's position, which contradicted his theory, was dismissed or misinterpreted. Radio guidance from the tower was resisted because it didn't match his internal model of reality. This is called confirmation bias, and every human has it. We see what we expect to see. We interpret ambiguous information as supporting what we already believe. And crucially, the more stressed we are, the more threatened, the more we double down on our existing beliefs rather than revising them. Taylor was in an impossible situation, responsible for 4 crews, low on fuel, over water, with failing instruments. The cognitive load was immense. In that state, the human brain doesn't become more rational, it becomes more rigid. It clings to its existing framework because constructing a new one requires mental resources that stress has depleted. This same pattern appears in accident after accident. Pilots who fly perfectly good planes into mountains because their instruments show altitude incorrectly, and they believe the instruments over the obvious visual cues. Hikers who walk past rescue teams because they're convinced they're heading in the right direction. Investors who ride stocks to zero because they can't abandon their thesis. Flight 19 is a parable about the fragility of human perception and decision-making under stress. It's a reminder that expertise and experience aren't always enough, that good people can make fatal mistakes not through negligence or stupidity, but through the very human tendency to construct a narrative and then defend it against conflicting evidence. And perhaps that's why the supernatural theories persist, because accepting that Flight 19 died due to human cognitive failure is in some ways more frightening than aliens or Atlantis. Supernatural forces are external, rare, special, but cognitive failure? That's universal. That's all of us, under the right circumstances. The ocean where Flight 19 disappeared isn't cursed, but it is unforgiving. The Atlantic doesn't care about experience or good intentions. It doesn't grant second chances to those who make navigation errors. Drop into its waters far from shore, and you have hours at best. Sink into its depths, and you're lost forever to pressures and currents that erase evidence of your existence. Since 1945, we've developed GPS, satellite tracking, emergency beacons, better training protocols, improved aircraft design. These technologies exist precisely because of disasters like Flight 19. The military learned, aviation learned. The deaths weren't meaningless. They pushed forward the evolution of safety systems that have saved countless lives since. But the fundamental challenge remains unchanged. Humans operating complex machines in unforgiving environments, making split-second decisions with incomplete information, fighting against cognitive biases they barely understand they have. Flight 19's disappearance reminds us that Mystery doesn't require the supernatural. Reality itself, the gap between what we think is happening and what is actually happening, the space between certainty and truth, is mysterious enough. 27 men flew into that gap on December 5th, 1945. They never came back. Their families waited for news that never came. Their bodies rest somewhere in the Atlantic's depths, if they rest at all, scattered and lost. We tell their story not because we have solved the mystery, we haven't, not completely, but because their disappearance tells us something true about being human, about how quickly the routine can become the catastrophic, about how the tools we trust can fail us, about how certainty can be deadly, and doubt, when it comes too late, can't save us. The Bermuda Triangle as a supernatural phenomenon probably doesn't exist. But the waters where Flight 19 disappeared are real. The ocean floor that holds their wreckage is real. The families who lost fathers and sons and brothers are real. The question of how it all went wrong, that's real too. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the lesson of Flight 19 isn't about explaining away the mystery, but about respecting it, about understanding that some questions have answers we find unsatisfying, not because they're wrong, but because they reveal uncomfortable truths about human limitation. On clear days, planes still fly over those waters. Ships still sail beneath. The Atlantic rolls on, indifferent and vast. And somewhere in its depths, 5 Avengers rest in darkness, their crews still at their stations, still together, lost, but not forgotten. That's the real mystery of Flight 19, not where they went, but how easily any of us could join them, how thin the line is between arriving home safely and vanishing without a trace, how fragile our grip on reality becomes when the instruments fail, and the mind, under stress, constructs a world that isn't there. We tell this story not to scare ourselves with supernatural theories, but to honor the truth that the universe doesn't need curses or aliens to be mysterious and dangerous. It just needs the ocean, the sky, fallible instruments, and human minds trying their best, but sometimes tragically getting it wrong. Flight 19 departed Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale on December 5th, 1945. They never arrived home. That's the simple, terrible truth. Everything else, every theory, every explanation, every legend, is our attempt to make peace with that truth. Some mysteries demand solutions. Others demand only that we remember and learn and fly more carefully into our own uncertain skies.